In this world, everyone receives special powers from the gods, and these abilities determine people's lifestyles. The anime begins with a carriage being attacked by a group of goblins, and a group of warriors appears to help protect the carriage. Meanwhile, our protagonist, a hungry boy named Fate Graphite, was on his shift guarding the castle while his stomach growled incessantly. Later, the group of warriors passes by him, discussing how they earned money and leveled up thanks to goblin hunting. Fate overhears their conversation and thinks about how he'll never be able to achieve something grand like them because he's just a useless person with an insatiable appetite due to the gluttony ability he received from the gods, which seemed to serve no purpose other than making him constantly hungry. However, Fate believes that at least he can continue working to support the Valeric family. Nearby, we see the three Valeric siblings who are holy knights responsible for the safety of the people. Due to their profession, they look down on others and mistreat them for trivial reasons. After some time, with Fate barely enduring the noise from his stomach, he's relieved that his shift is finally ending when the three siblings appear and ask if Fate did a good job in their place. When Fate responds positively, Raphael throws some coins on the ground as payment for the service. However, when Fate bends down to pick up the coins, Hada decides to have some fun by stepping on his hand. He calls Fate dirty and other cruel names while beating him for no reason, as his two brothers enjoy the situation, believing that people with abilities like Fate should be grateful because, in their opinion, they only earn money due to the pity of the Holy Knights. Fortunately, another girl named Roxy Hart, who was also part of their group, intervenes and puts an end to the abuse, stating that it's wrong for them to mistreat citizens they've sworn to protect. While the three siblings look at Roxy with disdain, she continues by saying that guarding the gate was a task meant for the Holy Knights, meaning they were passing their responsibility onto someone defenseless like Fate, even though it was their duty to ensure the city's safety. Raphael counters by saying that they also have a duty to provide employment to those in need, as if this were a valid excuse to mistreat Fate. Roxy questions the reason behind this treatment, but for the Valerics, it's merely a difference of professional opinion. Fortunately, the three siblings decide to leave Fate alone, and as they depart, Roxy rushes to help him, acting in stark contrast to the Valeric family, being kind and even assisting in cleaning his wounds. Fate thanks Roxy for her help, and she responds that it was no big deal, as they are fellow gatekeepers, and it's the attitude all Holy Knights should have. Next, Fate hands over his shift to Roxy, and she asks him not to allow such torture to happen again and to inform her if it does. However, Fate only thanks her for her concern but says he's used to it. Then he leaves Roxy at her post and goes to buy something to eat with the little money he earned. He thinks about Roxy's words, but Fate knows that even if she wants to help, it would only get her into trouble with the Valeric family. And for that reason, he believes he can't let her get involved in the situation in any way. At this moment, the restaurant owner notices that Fate has once again been mistreated by the Valerics and warns him that if he continues to endure this abuse and the brutal work at his job, he will end up like the other guy who worked for them. But the boy didn't have many options, so he simply thanks the owner for the food and leaves with his stomach still growling due to the gluttony ability, making him wish he had been born with something more valuable, not necessarily becoming a holy knight, but something more useful like a warrior, merchant, or even a craftsman. On his way back home, Fate spots some thieves who were invading the castle and rushes to inform Roxy, who was still guarding the gate. She immediately decides to leave her post to confront the thieves, leaving Fate in her place. He asks her to be careful, and she reassures him, saying she trusts his abilities. Some time passes with Fate listening to the sounds of Roxy's fight against the bandits, hoping everything will end well when suddenly the noise stops and one of the thieves appears wounded, running towards him. Fate freezes but remembers that if he flees, it will be Roxy who gets into trouble, so he faces his fear, determined not to let the thief escape. With his spear in front of him, Fate manages to defeat the bandit, and with this action, his gluttony ability is finally activated, boosting his stats. This surprises him, and when Roxy appears, worried about him, Fate can even hear her thoughts, leaving him more confused than before. However, as soon as Roxy releases his hand, he loses the ability to read her mind. She says she needs to report what happened to her superiors, and Fate suggests she not mention his help, thinking it might cause problems for her, as it was her shift. Roxy agrees not to say anything, thinking it's to avoid trouble with the Valeric family. However, she knows that she would have failed in her duty to protect the castle if it weren't for him, and as a way to thank him, she offers him a new job to work for her family, making it clear that he shouldn't worry about the Valerics, as he is the one who can decide his own future. This leaves him thoughtful. After all, it was a significant offer to leave the job with the three troublesome siblings who treated him like garbage to work for the Hart family with Roxy, who had always been kind to him. However, Fate worries about leaving his job as someone needs to guard the castle during his shift, but Roxy reminds him that it's a duty only for the Holy Knights, so he shouldn't be concerned. With no other reason to stay in his current job, Fate accepts Roxy's offer. Later, at his home, he analyzes the changes in his stats, noticing how they have increased. He realizes he has two new abilities, Identify and Telepathy, understanding that when he could read Roxy's thoughts before, it was the effect of telepathy. Despite not fully understanding what was happening, Fate thinks that with these stats, he might be able to defeat some monsters. So the next day, he goes to buy a useful weapon. Unfortunately, the 2 silver coins he had managed to save in 5 years in the capital can only buy him a weapon considered trash. With no other option, he examines each sword with his Identify ability, but they all have 0 durability and strength, until he notices a dirty black sword that catches his attention. He identifies it and learns that it's called Greed. For some reason, he can hear the sword's thoughts, and it tells him they have much in common, and that he won't regret keeping it. So Fate, intrigued by the talking sword, decides to buy it. Meanwhile, at the Vleric's house, Memel discusses the rumors he's heard about Roxy wanting to hire Fate to work for her family, considering it an affront to them. Raphael, on the other hand, says they don't need Fate because they can easily replace him. Memel persists, saying that Roxy questioned how they handled their duties as holy knights, but Raphael responds that it's not worth complicating things since the Hearts and the Vlerics are part of the 5 families supporting the king. Then he mentions he's leaving for the military district. His sister asks what he's studying there, and he answers that it's a study on how to become immortal, a response that Memel doesn't take seriously at all. Meanwhile, Fate decides to go to a secluded place to test his new talking sword when he's attacked by a goblin. He manages to activate his abilities in time to defend himself, eliminating the goblin and further increasing his stats. However, he soon realizes that goblins always travel in groups and finds himself surrounded by them. He begins to fight them one by one, blocking their attacks and taking them down individually. After spending the entire night battling the creatures and leveling up, he finally eliminates them all, exhausted from the prolonged fight. Fate then checks his stats and is shocked to see that he has acquired more new abilities, and to his delight, his stomach has finally stopped growling. He comments that he thought it wasn't possible to gain new abilities, and the sword explains that he managed this thanks to his gluttony. The sword tells him that people typically increase their stats in battles by gaining experience and leveling up, but gluttony allows him to steal abilities and stats from his opponents. The drawback is that he can't gain experience, which explains why he's still at level 1. He asks how the sword knows all this, and it replies that they are similar. Seeing some warriors approaching, the sword warns that gluttony is one of the abilities that defy divine laws and could cause problems if someone discovers this power. Upon hearing this, Fate decides to work alone, only with his talking sword, which reminds him that he needs money and suggests collecting goblin ears as trophies. After some work to collect the ears of the 38 goblins he defeated, Fate manages to obtain 3 silver coins and 80 bronze coins, celebrating the fact that he finally has enough money to buy some meat. However, the sword soon begins to demand maintenance, insisting that it should be treated like a jewel, which explains its name, Greed. At that moment, Fate accidentally bumps into a troublesome guy coming out of an alley with a little girl. When he touches her, Fate can hear the girl pleading for help. Clearly something is wrong, but when he uses Identify on the man, he realizes that the man can conceal his abilities, making them invisible. Despite not knowing what the man is capable of, Fate follows him to a hidden place where he has imprisoned and is torturing the girl without showing any mercy. The sword tries to convince Fate to back off, but Fate can't stand to see someone suffering and not do anything to help. He's determined to rescue the little girl. Nearby, in an orphanage, a nun tells the children that the goddess Laplace created the world, and when she departed, she bestowed a blessing upon each person, special powers they call abilities. She asks the children to thank Laplace for her blessings before their meal, and they all do so, except for one little boy. The nun asks if he's feeling unwell, and the boy says that Laplace isn't fair since she gave incredible abilities to some people, like the holy knights and warriors, while others like him receive weak abilities, explaining that's why he was abandoned. The nun then tells them that a long time ago, when Laplace still protected the world, before she gave abilities to people, there were no statuses or even monsters, with everyone living equally. The boy cries, saying he wished he had been born in that time, and at that moment, another nun appears, saying she couldn't find Sahara, a girl from the orphanage who had gone missing. She explains that she couldn't find her in the vicinity, so she'll search in the city. The lady looks at Sahara's empty chair, growing worried about what might have happened, unaware that the poor girl had been kidnapped by a man who was currently mistreating her. He intended to hand Sahara over to a knight, and she cried in fear of what would happen. Fortunately, Fate was there and seized a brief moment when the man left the girl alone to take action. However, as Fate was about to release Sahara from her chains, the man returned. He found Fate's attempt to play the hero quite foolish. Fate then prepared to fight, positioning himself in front of the girl to protect her. But since he didn't know what to do, his sword, Greed, suggested that the man clearly thought he was stronger than Fate, so he should play along to take advantage of that confidence. He decided to follow his sword's advice and ran away pretending to be afraid. This amused the man, thinking that if he killed Fate in front of the girl, she would become completely obedient to him. Then, after a while, Fate stopped running and knocked down some crates in the area, leaping over them to attack the man. Realizing that Fate was indeed going to fight to protect the girl, the man activated his weapon, making it glow, and Greed recognized it as a sharp blade. Greed instructed Fate to attack quickly and strike the man through his sword. The boy immediately did so, shattering the sharp blade and striking the man with a single blow. With the man defeated, Fate asked who the Holy Knight was who had ordered him to kidnap the child. However, as the man refused to speak, Fate forced him by placing his sword on the man's wound. This immediately made the man confess that he was hired by Hada of Lyric. After being rescued, Sahara began to feel hungry, and Fate heard her stomach growling. So the two of them finally introduced themselves, and Fate took her to eat something. He bought 2 meat skewers for them, and Sahara explained that it was the first time she had ever eaten meat in her life. Fate decided to give her the other skewer as well. At night, he returned the girl to the orphanage, where she immediately ran into the arms of the nun, who was overjoyed to see that she was safe. Both of them thanked Fate, leaving him surprised since no one had ever thanked him before. He explained to Sahara that he had a weak ability like her, and said that no matter the difficulties, if she could find humor in things, happiness would come one day. Sahara asked if this applied to her as well, and he said yes. Fate remembered that his father had told him that phrase when he was a child, and he had the same reaction as Sahara. But despite not understanding it at the time, thanks to that phrase, he had reached where he was, and he wished the same for Sahara. Then he said goodbye to the girl and continued on his way. Later, Fate checked his status and realized that he had acquired the one-handed sword technique, the same ability as the kidnapper. Greed explained to Fate that with this ability, he could learn secret arts and techniques as well as strike twice as fast. Fate then realized that the man could have used this technique when they were fighting, and it wouldn't have ended well for him. He questioned why Greed didn't warn him of the danger. The sword replied that it would have been terrible to interrupt his heroic moment, and Fate said that if he had known the risks, he wouldn't have done anything. Then Greed said that battles depended a lot on luck, and victory wasn't guaranteed to the stronger opponent. However, this made Fate wish for even more power so that he wouldn't have to rely on luck. At that moment, Greed reminded Fate that the next day would be his first day of work at the Hart family's house, and he was still wearing the same rags as before, reminding the boy that he needed to buy some new clothes. Meanwhile, at the tavern Fate used to frequent, the innkeeper talked to a customer. He mentioned that he had heard that Mason, Roxy's father, was defeated by a divine dragon in Gallia and that she would now take his place. But since her father had been the one keeping the knights in check, everyone was afraid because they doubted if Roxy could control the troublemaking knights like the Valeric brothers. The next day, Fate went to his first day of work wearing more appropriate clothes. He was impressed by the size of the place when he met Roxy, who was already waiting for his arrival. Later, Roxy introduced Fate to her father, taking him to his grave. She explained that he had passed away 5 days ago while fighting a divine dragon in Gallia, a continent dominated by monsters. She said that being a holy knight was a dangerous task, as one of their duties was to contain monsters like a divine dragon that hadn't left its lair for over 1,000 years, which led to her father and his entire army being annihilated. This took Fate by surprise, as he didn't know what Roxy was going through, and even though she was in mourning, she still cared about him. She told Fate that she, the new leader of the Hart family, was counting on him. They shook hands, but Fate remembered that shaking hands allowed him to read her thoughts, so he used the arrival of a houseworker to avoid the handshake. Roxy introduced Fate to the worker named Haru, the Hart family's housekeeper, and asked him to behave appropriately as a good servant of the Harts. Fate agreed to her request. Later, he enjoyed a hearty meal for the first time in 5 years, which left him quite excited, but Haru was irritated by his behavior. A week later, Fate was trimming the garden grass when 2 men appeared, asking him not to overexert himself and to take a break. They mentioned that initially they found him strange, talking to his sword and eating meat as if the world were ending. Fate explained that it was because he had gone a long time without eating any meat. His stomach growled at that moment, and the 2 men were puzzled because Fate had just had a meal. Haru then arrived and told Fate that Roxy was calling for him. Fate went to see her, not understanding why his hunger wouldn't go away even though he had eaten well. He met Roxy in the garden, and she asked if he had gotten used to the work. But he didn't respond because his head was still focused on his rumbling stomach. Roxy called him Faye, an affectionate nickname, and when Fate finally realized she was calling him, he remembered his late father, who used to call him that. Fate explained to Roxy that his father had died on a monster hunt, and she realized that they both had lost their parents, having that in common. Fate then asked the reason for the nickname, and Roxy said that now that he worked for her family, he was practically a part of it. This made Fate feel embarrassed, but suddenly, he started feeling weak and passed out. When he woke up, Fate found a note from Roxy saying that he was free from duties the next day to rest and recover. He asked Greed if she knew why he was getting hungrier, especially since he used to endure his hunger much better in the past. Greed found it odd that he was asking this only now and explained that once the gluttony tasted the souls, the hunger only worsened. The more he devoured, the stronger he would become, but that also meant he would want to eat more, and he was destined to consume souls as long as he lived. Essentially, he had to feed gluttony, or he would lose control and attack anyone in his path. Fate was horrified, feeling like he was becoming a monster. Greed warned that when his hunger was nearing its limit, it would show in his eyes. Fate looked in the mirror and saw that his eyes were red, a clear sign that he was nearing his limit. Knowing this, Fate set out to hunt monsters. Greed explained that the red eyes were a temporary power that improved the use of the gluttony ability, granting him night vision and the ability to track prey by scent. It also induced fear in weaker prey, which was why a group of goblins he found remained frozen in place, making his hunt easier. He attacked them one by one, but after defeating them, he still had red eyes. So Fate went to the hobgoblin forest to continue his hunt, growing increasingly hungry. After a while, he finally satisfied his insatiable hunger, and Greed recommended that Fate hunt monsters more often to avoid reaching his limit. Suddenly, a large creature appeared, and Fate discovered it was the Goblin King. He analyzed the creature's status, finding little difference between them except for the regeneration ability that allowed the goblin to heal. Greed explained that with it, Fate could continue fighting even when injured, which made the boy desire to acquire the ability. He approached the goblin silently for a surprise attack, but the creature survived, forcing Fate to confront it again. After another attack, Fate finally defeated the Goblin King and gained the regeneration ability, improving his status. However, after all this hard work to improve himself, Greed suggested that he offer his status to her as an offering so she could reach her first level and change form, gaining new functions. Fate became interested in enhancing his weapon, but Greed explained that to achieve that, he would need to give up everything he had gained since they met. Emphasizing her name, Greed, wasn't a coincidence. So Fate had to choose between becoming stronger on his own or sharing his strength with his sword to journey together. As Greed was his only partner, he decided to stay with her, giving up his status. Immediately, Fate felt his power fading and Greed transformed into a magical bow. To demonstrate how it worked, Greed revealed a goblin that had been watching them and asked Fate to shoot it. She explained that the arrows would appear on their own and always hit the target, regardless of where he aimed. Fate took the arrows and shot the creature, impressed with his new weapon. Then he collected the Goblin King's ears and gave them to the orphanage, knowing that the money they would receive would feed the children for a long time.